The Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game has been around since 2002 in North America, where it immediately became an instant hit just like in Japan, and almost 20 years later it's still going strong in 2021. But despite the physical card game's quick, widespread popularity, other aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! Such as video games have seen more mixed historical popularity in the West, despite how memorable some of these games have been for some of us. In this video, we'll be diving into the complete history of all Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games with an English release. Before we begin, don't forget to leave that like, comment, subscribe, and turn on those notifications if you want to see more videos like this. Alright, let's begin. Although this video covers all English Yu-Gi-Oh! Games extensively, I'll briefly go over the first several Japan-only games, just to give you a bit of historical context. The first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game, which released in 1998 in Japan, and which translated to Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Capsule, Breed and Battle, was very different than the traditional card game we know. The game visually resembles a tactical role-playing game, kind of like the Final Fantasy Tactics series, but gameplay-wise it's a more advanced take on the Capsule monster chess game in Japan as well. This game was then followed by Japan's second game titled Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, and then in 1999, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 2 Dark Duel Stories. And no, this is not the Dark Duel Stories that you're probably thinking of. But now this leads me to a very important point in that the naming of Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games is an absolute nightmare because of international name conflicts that confuses people so much. It's kind of like how Final Fantasy VI was originally Final Fantasy III in North America, and because of that, to this day there are a whole bunch of people that think they actually played Final Fantasy III growing up, but it was actually Final Fantasy VI all along. Anyway, in 1999, Yu-Gi-Oh! True Duel Monsters Sealed Memories released in Japan, which would eventually be the second Yu-Gi-Oh! Title released in North America. I'll get to the first in just a bit. In the West, it was released as the much more recognizable name Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories for the PlayStation in March 2002. This game takes place in ancient Egypt, and yes, it does actually have a progressive story. Gameplay-wise though, it was shocking to many people that it didn't resemble a real card game at all. What do I mean by this? Let's break it down. First, there's no tribute summoning or fusion summoning, meaning you could do things like just drop a 3500 attack Meteor Black Dragon from your hand with no effort. Second, you could only play one card on your field every turn, meaning you couldn't set a back row, activate a spell card, and summon a monster on the same turn. You had to pick only one of those options. Third, you actually have to play one card per turn. You can't just draw and pass your turn like in a real life card game. Fourth, although there's no fusion summoning, there was a different fusion mechanic in this game, which essentially required you to memorize different card properties so you know what you could fuse into. For example, a warrior and a plant could make Bean Soldier because Bean Soldier physically resembles a combination of a warrior and a plant, but it would only work if both monsters had a less than 1400 attack, otherwise it would fail. And also, not all plants would actually be quote plants for fusion summoning purposes. A card like Firegrass could actually be treated as a fire elemental monster by the game, and thus you could possibly fusion into something unexpected instead. I realize this may be confusing to you, especially if you never actually played the game, and as confusing as it was, it actually becomes quite fun eventually, because you'll shortly realize that if you want to beat this game without cheat codes, you have to fusion. You just have to do it, it's that hard. There's also other things in the game that don't resemble the physical card game, such as Guardian Stars and always drawing until you have 5 cards in the hand, but I think you get it. Oh, and there's a card shop that doesn't actually sell cards at all. What? Anyway, the reason why this game doesn't resemble the real-life card game is because despite it releasing in March 2002 in North America, which were the same year and month the TCG debuted, remember that it was actually the same game released in 1999 in Japan, which was undergoing development since about 98. This was well before the TCG and OCG were an actual thing, so the development team used prototype rules that were being considered as the actual game was gradually being adopted from the manga. Obviously we know now that a lot of these rules were not actually brought into the OCG nor the TCG. Moving forward, Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Capsule GB was another title released only in Japan, but then in July of 2000, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 3 Tri-Holy God Advent released in Japan, and this game would eventually become Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Duel Stories in North America in March 2002. So now we have a game called Dark Duel Stories in Japan that's not the same game as Dark Duel Stories in North America. Oh, and also, this game released almost a year later than Sealed Memories in Japan, but it released on March 18th, 2002 in North America. But Forbidden Memories released in March 20th, 2002, only 2 days apart, and we got two Yu-Gi-Oh! Games one after the other. This was also the same month that Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon and Starter Deck Yu-Gi and Kaiba were released. Wow, talk about a strong start in the West. But yes, this does make Dark Duel Stories the first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! Game released in North America. As for the game itself, it shares a lot of resemblance to Forbidden Memories in terms of gameplay. Visually, it looks like a step back, but that's understandable because we're comparing a Game Boy Color game to a PlayStation 1 game. The game hardly has a story, as it more so uses the concept of beat these duelists X many times to advance to the next tier, an aspect that would be used in so many Yu-Gi-Oh! Games moving forward. There were still fusions in this game, but unlike the Forbidden Memories Guardian Stars, which would increase or decrease a monster by 500 points, it used the iconic alignment system, which means that a monster of a certain alignment would automatically trump a monster of alignment it's good against. You can find these online all over the place, but basically there are two separate cycles, the magic cycle and the natural element cycle. So if you ever wanted to see your Karibo take down a Blue Eyes White Dragon, play this game. The game also introduced a deck capacity system in which each card has a deck cost and you couldn't exceed your overall capacity. But there were also custom parts you could get, which could then make a custom card later. It was very weird, but also effective since a lot of these had low cost but high stats. Still though, a lot of players to this day still claim that this is one of the weirdest Yu-Gi-Oh! Games ever, and playing it just for a few minutes will quickly make you believe that. Moving forward in the timeline, we have Duel Monsters 4 Battle of the Great Duelists as another Japan-only release, followed by Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 5 Expert 1. Duel Monsters 5 is a North American title, The Eternal Duelist Soul, released in October 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. This was the first game in North America to follow the official TCG rules. It still followed the beat these duelists X many times to advance to the next tier concept, but it also introduced a booster pack reward, which would be a very iconic idea brought back into many Yu-Gi-Oh! Games later. Basically, you can choose one pack with every win and you start with a few booster packs, and you can unlock more by completing certain conditions, such as by beating certain duelists a number of times or by having a specific card in your trunk. The game also had no deck capacity system, and it did have a password system that didn't require a currency, so you could get as many free cards as possible if you wanted to cheese it through. Although there was the rule of only getting one copy of a card with the password. Overall, that was the game though. No story, just advancing and winning duels with the occasional weekend duel or cup tournament which would be marked on your calendar. After this, Duel Monsters 6 Expert 2 was released in Japan only as usual because it seemed by this point only every other game in the Duel Monsters series would get a North American release. In February 2003, however, Dungeon Dice Monsters was released in North America for the Game Boy Advance. This game would be the first of many North American releases to divert away from the traditional card game. Dungeon Dice Monsters basically uses dice instead of cards, and every monster within Dungeon Dice Monsters has their own specific dice with unique sides and values. The goal is to slowly get your opponent's die master and take out their 3 hearts. Monsters need movement crest to move, attack crest to attack, guard crest to defend, and some may need magic or trap crest to activate special abilities. Most monsters are land-based, but some are flyers that cannot be hit by land monsters, but the downside is that they require twice as many movement crests to move. There's also tunnelers that can tunnel under monsters, and there are flying attack monsters that are land-based but can hit flyers. The game also uses an alignment advantage system, but monsters don't automatically trump one another if they have the advantage. Instead, they just gain 10 extra attack or defense. Overall, the gameplay of Dungeon Dice Monsters is simply just tournaments. Win tournaments to unlock harder tournaments while also gaining dice and money to buy more dice so you can upgrade your dice pool. And any opponents you beat in tournaments can be freely battled in free duel mode. And that's basically it. It's a solid game, but also not for everyone. 4 days after the release of Dungeon Dice Monsters, The Duelist of the Roses was released for the PlayStation 2 in February as well. This game was titled Yu-Gi-Oh! True Duel Monsters 2 Inherited Memories in Japan, which basically shows it's the sequel or at least successor to Forbidden Memories. Although successor, however, the game was quite different. Story-wise, it's loosely based on the English Wars of the Roses events, but gameplay-wise, oh boy is it wild. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's basically a large grid where you can summon or set monsters, move them, and approach the enemy to eventually attack. The goal is to lower your opponent's life points from 4,000 to 0. You can also place spell and traps face down, some which trigger when opponent's monsters approach. Certain monsters have effects, and many of them do not share the same effect as their real-life counterpart. There's many different types of grids, many of which resemble the terrain field spells at the time, such as forest or mountain. But some are unique to this game, such as the labyrinth terrain, which prohibits most monsters from traversing it, the crush terrain, which immediately destroys any monster that steps on it with 1500 attack or more, or even the comical toon terrain, which lowers the stats of all non-toon monsters and boosts all toon monsters. Compared to previous Yu-Gi-Oh games, it has quite the sense of plot progression. Essentially, you're going through the lands and continents to defeat your opponent, either the Lancastrians or Yorkists, depending on which side you pick. Mastering this game is quite a learning curve, but when you do, wow is it enjoyable. In April of 2003, Yu-Gi-Oh! Worldwide Edition Stairway to the Destined Duel was released for the Game Boy Advance. This was actually the first game to be released in North America before Japan. In Japan, it released 2 days later by the title Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters International Worldwide Edition. This is incredibly similar to the Eternal Duelist Soul. The duels look visually identical and even the sound effects are the exact same between both games, but the progression of the game is where this game improved on. The game is basically Battle City. You're in Battle City meeting and dueling opponents while strengthening your deck to get to the game's major story, the Rare Hunter plot. The unique part about this game is how you go about moving. While you're not physically moving and controlling your character, you are always in a particular section of the city, and the next day, you can always either stay in your spot or move to an adjacent spot. Any duelist you've already beaten will have their face appear in the icon, so you know what you're getting into. The free password system is also back, so that's a nice plus, but the game's post-game also has a unique twist. You can enter these so-called limitation duels, where you have to win duels by abiding to certain rules such as warriors only, spellcasters only, no effect monsters, or only monsters with 1000 attack or less. They're challenging but also fun and will make beating the game even more worth it. The next two games on the list are Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 7, the Duel City Legend, which would eventually be called Yu-Gi-Oh! The Sacred Cards in North America, and also Yu-Gi-Oh! False-Bound Kingdom, the Confined Imaginary Kingdom, which would be titled Yu-Gi-Oh! The False-Bound Kingdom in North America. I'm grouping these together because both were released on the same day in North America, November 4th, 2003. The Sacred Cards went back to the roots of the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games that had a Western release, meaning that it didn't really follow the actual TCG rules. Instead, it was a more simplified game without the use of turn phases such as main phase 1, battle phase, and so on and so forth. You just summon monsters and then mostly just attack and defend. The game also brings back deck capacity and deck costs as well as the alignment matchup, but the key difference between this game and the older ones kinda makes it more like a hybrid between the actual TCG and these aforementioned older Yu-Gi-Oh! Games. Some examples are that you can actually play more than one card per turn. You can summon a monster and play some face down cards or activate spell cards. You also only draw one card per turn, and you're not forced to play a card at all, so you can just pass. Tribute summoning is also a thing in this one, unlike in Forbidden Memories, and these are all rules just like in the TCG. A major element that made this game very attractive, however, was that you can actually control your character and move around to talk to people and duel opponents. The game does have a world map, but you aren't limited to the map in Worldwide Edition. You can actually move around and interact. It also has an actual story too, a very generic one related to the anime, but at least it had one unlike most of the games on the list so far. Overall, the game was a nice step up in mixing Yu-Gi-Oh! Gameplay elements with an actual adventure and traveling feeling to it. The False-Bound Kingdom, however, was very different. The easiest way to describe it is that it was a mix of a real-time strategy game as well as an RPG. There are no card duels or battles at all. Instead, it's simply strategize and attack with your party. That's right, it almost makes it feel like you have an actual party, but not a party of characters that go through character development as the game progresses, but instead it's a party full of duel monsters that are beating the hell out of each other. The game features 177 monsters, and the game's story revolves around emperors, kings, kingdoms, and the god cards. You know, your typical Yu-Gi-Oh! Game plot. You can also play through the game up to 3 times while still feeling fresh because there's Yugi's story, Kaiba's story, and Joey's story. To sum it up, if you're a fan of either of these two mixed genres, you'll love it. If you prefer classic dueling though, it's probably not for you. The next three games are going to get grouped together because of their resemblance to one another. Yu-Gi-Oh! Power of Chaos, Yu-Gi-Oh! Destiny, Yu-Gi-Oh! Power of Chaos, Kaiba the Revenge, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Power of Chaos, Joey the Passion. All three of these games were released in 2004 for strictly PC, and these are some of the only Yu-Gi-Oh! Games to have actually never been officially released in Japan. The three games in order kind of serve as a beginner to advanced journey. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Destiny, you go through basic tutorials on playing Yu-Gi-Oh! With a little bit of dueling as well. In Kaiba the Revenge, you learn more about strategic combos to try to take down Kaiba. And in Joey the Passion, there's more dueling choices, more dueling options, and more decks to duel against. So naturally, Joey the Passion is the game with the most content out of the three. Each game also adds more cards from the previous games. Yu-Gi-Oh! Destiny, for example, has 155 cards. Kaiba the Revenge has 311 new cards, but also uses the 155 cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Destiny, for a total of 466 cards. And Joey the Passion introduces 245 new cards and adds the 466 cards from the previous two games for a grand total of 771. Overall, to get the best experience from this series of games, it's best to play them in order so it makes you feel like you're actually gradually making progress throughout the games, while also slowly getting more card choices and more decks to get stronger. 2004 saw the release of several other games, including the Japan-only Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters Beginners Pack for the Game Boy Advance. But as for other games, Reshaft of Destruction, Destiny Board Traveler, The Dawn of Destiny, and Capsule Monsters Colosseum all released for North America. Let's take these one at a time. Reshaft of Destruction at first glance looks like a complete copy of the Sacred Cards, and that's because visually it basically is. It's the direct sequel to the Sacred Cards story-wise, so if you want the full story, you have to play both in order. But yes, the gameplay is the exact same and the visuals are the same cartoonish and colorful graphics. But there is one key difference between both games. Reshaft of Destruction is much harder than the Sacred Cards. I mean much harder. Seriously. This game is absolutely brutal in difficulty, and if you go online to forums and communities, you'll commonly see that this game usually gets the most votes for being the hardest Yu-Gi-Oh! Game of all time. I have the impression that Konami thought the Sacred Cards was far too easy, and so what did they do? They limited the typical deck capacity increase to 1 per regular duel, and barely gave you any money. The deck costs are enormously high for high attack monsters and staple spell and traps. In addition, opponents' cards spike up in difficulty incredibly fast. By the time you're at like your second main story duel, you'll quickly find that your monsters have an average of like 1,000 less attack than your opponents, and you're constantly in fields where they benefit the opponent a lot more than yours. And remember, there's no fusioning in this game, so you can't just mix your garbage stat monsters into higher ones like in Forbidden Memories or Dark Duel Stories. I did a whole playthrough of this game on my channel, and my god, did it take weeks to months of grinding just to have enough deck capacity, duelist level, and money to get some decent cards. And to all of you who know this game really well, let's thank Konami for making the Winged Dragon of Ra playable card late game. I'm sure you know this, but the game would basically be impossible to beat without the Winged Dragon of Ra. If you want to know why, watch my playthrough of this game. But let's just say there's so much BS when you do not use the Egyptian god cards. Destiny Board Traveler, on the other hand, is usually found on top of the list of worst Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games of all time. The game was released as Sugoroku's board game in Japan, and the best way to describe the game is that it's a board game that involves dice and the occasional monster battle. You pick your character, the opponents, and the board, and then you start. You win by either reaching the amount of stars, which increases with the more monsters you control, or by depleting everyone else's life points and being the last player alive. While it may look fun at first, when you actually play it, you'll quickly see just how little control and play you have over the game. About 95% of the game is just pressing the A button, so it's really just A button simulator. There are 4 characters per game, and you're one of them, so already 75% of the time, meaning the other 3 characters' turns, you're just pressing the A button to advance their turns and prompts. You press it when text boxes come up, when they roll their dice, or other small events too. And during your turn, you press it when text boxes come up, you roll your dice, and other small events too. Literally the only time you're actually able to even scroll left or right is when you're making the dice. That's about the only strategical element of the game, but even that has some luck because you're still relying on the game giving you the option for certain ones to come up. Every character has their own dice, yes, but you'll quickly feel just how stale it is after about 20 minutes of playing the game. The Dawn of Destiny, however, returns to more traditional dueling. The game has a bigger emphasis on the monsters' 3D models with the goal of immersing you in the 3D world every time monsters battle. The game has a little bit over 1,000 cards, which is around where other games were at the time, such as Worldwide Edition. The game progresses by you winning duels, of course, with the option of either single mode or triple mode. Single mode is self-explanatory, but triple mode serves as a gauntlet where you have to duel 3 opponents back to back, and your life points do carry over from each duel. You gain card rewards from the god statues that give you cards depending on which duelist you beat and what mode you want in, either single or triple. Overall, the game was okay for what it was. It got decent reviews, but it didn't redefine the genre or anything. The next game on the list is Capsule Monster Colosseum. This game focused on the Capsule Monsters games, which was the other popular game introduced in the manga way back then. It already had some popularity in Japan, but this was the first time most players in the West were introduced to it. The game uses a symbol feature and there are 8 monster types: light, dark, earth, thunder, fire, wood, wind, and water. A version of the alignment system returns in this game, and overall, yes, it's dangerous to have only one monster type, because an opposing advantageous symbol could easily wipe you out. The campaign starts with Yugi entering a Capsule Monsters tournament, but even he doesn't know how to play the game at first. You basically keep advancing as you go through arenas and new opponents to claim the King of Capsule Monsters title. The overall object of the game is to use your monsters to either destroy all of your opponent's monsters or their symbol. After each game, monsters are able to level up so they're stronger for the next game. There are also terrains that provide field power bonuses, and fusing does return, but in a bit of a different way. The game was overall a nice new addition and twist for YuGiOh. It's also a big learning curve and could be complicated at first, but very entertaining once you get the gist of it. It's easy to see that during this time, Konami was in an experimental phase with their YuGiOh brand by attempting to move beyond just a regular card game. The simple evidence is the existence of Dungeon Dice Monsters, Destiny Board Traveler, The False-Bound Kingdom, The Duelist of the Roses, and Capsule Monster Colosseum, none of which are regular YuGiOh at all. This experimental phase would die shortly after 2004 because between the 16 years from 2005 to the present day in 2021, there's really only been one more YuGiOh game that has been way different than the typical card game, but we'll get to that eventually. The other noteworthy thing during this time was the introduction of Konami's most popular YuGiOh game series known as World Championship games. The first was World Championship Tournament in 2004, and they would continue to make one every single year up until 2011 when the series just abruptly ended. The first 3 games in the series were released for Game Boy Advance. 2004 was known as Duel Monsters Expert 3 in Japan, and this game was overall very similar to Eternal Duelist Soul, meaning actual TCG rules and no actual story, just defeating opponents to unlock the next tier. You could have 3 different decks going at the same time, so you didn't have to constantly change out your one deck, and although visually it looks similar to both Eternal Duelist Soul and Worldwide Edition, some of the sound effects were now different. Also, there was no password system in this game, meaning that the only way to get cards was to win duels and open booster packs. 2005, however, was known as YuGiOh Duel Monsters International 2 in Japan, and YuGiOh Day of the Duelist World Championship Tournament 2005 in Europe. But in North America, it was titled YuGiOh 7 Trials to Glory World Championship Tournament 2005. The game changed up quite a few things. For one, duels are now in a black background environment as opposed to a background motion design, and the duel view is now angled as opposed to top down. The bigger thing, however, is that you get to walk around again, similar to the Sacred Cards and Reshaft of Destruction, but the unfortunate thing is the game's annoying rotating forbidden list. Basically, every in-game week the ban list rotates, which means you're constantly having to switch out your staples because one week they may be limited, next week semi-limited, and the next week forbidden. The card shop concept also makes a return, and now you no longer get a booster pack at the end of each duel. Instead, you're granted DP, which you can then spend on the card shop to buy some packs. You gain more DP for winning weekend tournaments and other cups as well. Also, the game's title, 7 Trials, is quite literal in this game. Essentially, win the weekend tournament 7 different times to unlock the KC Cup, which is a tournament consisting of 7 rounds. After you win the KC Cup, you'll get access to the Limitation Tournament, which also has 7 different rounds. And then after winning that, you'll make it to the Championship, where if you win, you beat the game. The postgame, however, has disgusting decks that bypass the forbidden list, but the good news is that it applies to you now too. So you can make decks with like 3 Pot of Grease and 3 Graceful Charities and so on and so forth, which makes it fun in some ways. The area is called the Shadow World, where you basically duel a bunch of rare hunters for cards and duel recipes, and the ultimate challenge is the game's survival match and dark survival match, where you take part in a gauntlet against these disgusting decks to win ridiculous amounts of DP. It's quite an insane challenge. 2006 was Duel Monsters Expert 2006 in Japan, or Ultimate Masters World Championship Tournament 2006 in North America. This game went back to 2004's concept with no moving character on the field nor a world map. Instead, you just choose your opponent, beat them a couple times, and unlock the next tier. However, the bulk of the game is beyond the regular duels, as the game instead is filled with challenges such as duel puzzles where you're put in a scenario where you have to win this turn, limited duel, which is like the previous game's limitation duels, theme duels where you have to duel and complete a certain criteria, such as activate 10 traps in a duel or recover 20,000 life points in a duel, and so on and so forth. And lastly, survival duel, which is a gauntlet challenge to try and defeat as many opponents in a row. These challenges were definitely returned to later World Championship games as well, and so it was a big inspiration toward future titles. Before we continue with the World Championship games in the DS era, there's a few more games to cover first. In 2005, YuGiOh Online was released for the PC, which would have two updated versions released later, YuGiOh Online Duel Evolution in 2007, and YuGiOh Online Duel Accelerator in 2009. These games were just basically dueling online, and you could buy cards with booster pass points known as BP. But YuGiOh Online was ultimately retired on September 2012, and while Konami didn't give a reason why, many people speculate it was because of online hackers ruining everyone's experience. The last game released for the Game Boy Advance was YuGiOh GX Duel Academy, a game that combined Yu-Gi-Oh's dueling elements with dorm life in an academy. There's an actual calendar with days, weeks, and months passing by, and it's pretty accurate to what you would expect, meaning you go to class Monday through Friday, but in the weekends you're free to explore the island and duel. You start in Slifer Redding and progressively unlock more characters as you go, but if you perform well in the monthly exam, which consists of a practical exam duel, a time duel scenario, and a written examination, you get to move to Raw Yellow or even Obelisk Blue. The unofficial ending of the game is when you get the King of Games title, which is quite a difficult grind but very doable eventually. Moving into the Nintendo DS era, we'll start with two related games, Nightmare Troubadour released in 2005 and GX Spirit Caller released in early 2007. And FYI, for gameplay purposes for any DS games, I'll just use my game footage for my walkthroughs, that way I can show both screens at the same time. The two games are very similar to one another, with the noteworthy difference being that Nightmare Troubadour uses the Duel Monsters cast and Spirit Caller uses GX characters. The games implement an advanced take on Worldwide Edition's map concept. There's still a world out with potential duelists in various places, but now it's a little more interactive because you have to follow the game's prompts and alerts indicating that you're getting closer and closer. Then a duelist may pop up and you get to choose if you want to approach or not. The card shop returns in both games and is very similar to 7 Trials to Glory, where you spend your points to get cards. There is a story in both games, but it can be difficult to advance it sometimes without an online walkthrough. This is because oftentimes you need to be in the right place at the right time to trigger a specific event to advance, and it's not like the game always gives you hints as to where to explore. Still though, that aside, it was clear that these games were leaning towards the right direction. In terms of dueling, it's pretty smooth overall, and because they're on the DS, these games allowed you to use the touchscreen on duels to a certain extent, which potentially made duels a bit faster if you were a fan of using the stylus. Going back to the World Championship series, but this time for the DS, we have 5 more games on the list. World Championship 2007, GX World Championship 2008, 5D's Stardust Accelerator World Championship 2009, 5D's World Championship 2010 Reverse of Arcadia, and 5D's World Championship 2011 Over the Nexus. The first 2 games cover the GX era, while the latter 3 use 5Ds. 2007 followed 2006 very closely, with basic tiers of dueling monsters giving you a chance to eventually advance to the next tier if you defeated all the prior duelists a set number of times. It also had similar bonus features such as dueling challenges, puzzles, and theme duels. 2008 also followed very similar footsteps to the previous games in the series, but the biggest new twist was an actual story mode that wasn't just beat these duelists X many times and that's it. The game had different areas where you could find monsters to duel which serve as the regular duels of the game, but there were also special duels where you had to sometimes complete certain puzzles or reach a certain criteria to unlock special duelists, with one certain world being unique to tag duels. Overall, the entry was a nice step forward into the series, but in 2009, however, Stardust Accelerator did everything in its power to one-up World Championship 2008. Although it still had the regular World Championship mode from previous entries, its story mode was far more advanced than anything we've ever seen in a World Championship game. For one, it brought back the mechanic of you actually getting to move your character around story mode, something we hadn't seen since World Championship 2005. But even more than that, it was a full detailed intricate story mode where you get to meet with the various 5D's characters, go through character development, gradually upgrade your deck throughout, engage in tag duels and even turbo duels on occasion. You also get to participate in racing and trials, all while fighting the evil of the world. This game would set the foundation for both Reverse of Arcadia and Over the Nexus, both of which were pretty similar to Stardust Accelerator. These three games are exactly the reason why when you hear many fans nowadays say, we just want a 5Ds World Championship Yu-Gi-Oh video game again, this is exactly what they're referring to. Games with good gameplay dueling, solid soundtracks, bonus features in World Championship mode, and very detailed stories. The one big downside, mostly from Reverse of Arcadia and over the Nexus, is the incredibly slow AI sometimes, where they're, quote, thinking for usually 20 plus seconds every single action. Stupidly annoying, but if you look past that, the games are actually very good. The DS also saw the release of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Card Almanac in 2007. This technically isn't a Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game as it just details card lists up until Strike of Neos. It also includes a database of popular combos, so in a way this game could teach you meta Yu-Gi-Oh! To a certain extent at the time. Lastly, it also included tools to aid in real-life Yu-Gi-Oh! Such as a life point calculator, virtual coin flips, and virtual die rolls. I know this may sound silly nowadays because we have smartphones that can do all this but much quicker and more efficient, but you have to remember that this was 2007, which was the year when the iPhone 1 was released. So smartphones were barely being introduced at this point and quite honestly weren't all that smart or quick yet. Time to move on to the second flagship series after World Championship, Yu-Gi-Oh! Tag Force. The series is composed of 8 different games and they're as follows: Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Tag Force in 2006, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Tag Force 2 in 2007, Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Tag Force 3, which never released in North America but released around 2008 in other regions, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Tag Force 4 in 2009, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Tag Force 5 in 2010, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Tag Force 6, a Japan-only title in 2011, Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V Tag Force Special, another Japan-only title released in 2015, and also Yu-Gi-Oh! Tag Force Evolution, which was a port of the original Tag Force, but this one was released for the PS2, while all others were PSP-only releases. And by the way, Tag Force Evolution was titled The Beginning of Destiny in North America. Anyway, the main feature of Tag Force games is, as the name suggests, tag dueling. Tag duels are laid out in such a way where you take a turn, then the first opponent, then your partner, then the other opponent. Most games in this series are composed of different parts or sections where you usually spend some time at the beginning befriending potential partners, and then eventually you participate in tag duels to compete in tournaments or even plotlines against evil. The games also have random events, options for solo or tag duels on different components of the game, and as the series continued, more and more features were included such as Destiny Draw and Partner Synchros. Tag Force 1, 2, 3, and Evolution were in the GX era, while 4, 5, and 6 were 5Ds. Arc V Tag Force was, well, Arc V era. The sad part was that it was around this time when both flagship series, which were Yu-Gi-Oh! Tag Force and Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship, ended in North America and many other regions outside Japan. As Tag Force 5 released in 2010, but Tag Force 6 and Arc V Tag Force were Japan exclusive, while Over the Nexus in 2011 was the last World Championship released as well. Truly a big end to an era in Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games. I'll be backtracking just a little bit because there are 4 other 5Ds games I need to cover. The first is Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Wheeliebreakers, released for the Wii in 2009. This is the other non-traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! Game I was referring to, because it's basically a racing game that uses cards and effects as power-ups for yourself or downgrades for the opponents. There's a main story where in each level you race a different opponent, with increasing difficulty as you continue to advance. You start with a deck of 15 cards and you begin races with 5 cards. Drive over card icons to get more cards and use cards to utilize their effects. If you select a monster, you can summon that monster over your duel runner for protection against other attacks, and if you don't have a monster, you'll take direct damage. Lose all your life points and you'll spin out for a few seconds before getting a chance to try again. The game is pretty complex since there's a lot you can do while also having to keep your eyes on the road and not crash. And the game is notorious for having annoyingly obnoxious rubber band AI. But overall, it's another game that's not for everyone, especially if you're looking to play regular old Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Master of the Cards, however, is a much more traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! Title. This game was named Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's Duel Transer in North America, and it was released in 2010. The duels are regular old Yu-Gi-Oh! While using the card pools from the 5D's era, but it's outside the duels where this game is very unique. It uses a step tile mechanic which requires a lot of strategical thinking from the player to get to items using as few steps as possible before they disappear, while also potentially avoiding certain duelists. There are also lock tiles which require coming back later in the game when you have certain cards that can break the locks. Later in the game you run into some hidden duelists and more dangerous tiles that definitely make the game more challenging but very enjoyable as well. To this date, it's definitely one of the most unique Yu-Gi-Oh games ever released, while still having plain old Yu-Gi-Oh in its duels for those big time dueling fanatics. 2009 saw the release of another 5Ds title, but in Japan only, titled Yu-Gi-Oh 5Ds Mobile, released for iMode, EasyWeb, and Yahoo Mobile, which, if you've never heard of them, they're basically mobile phone operators in Japan. Because it was a mobile game released in Japan only, it's pretty much impossible to find video footage of it, but doing a Google image search will net you a couple photos at least. But another 5Ds game released worldwide was Yu-Gi-Oh 5Ds Decade Duels in 2010, for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 online services. It was released from service in June 2011, but later re-released as Yu-Gi-Oh 5Ds Decade Duels Plus. This game was similar to and possibly inspired a later game, Yu-Gi-Oh Millennium Duels, released in 2014 also for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 online services. Both games had a very straightforward single player where you simply defeat opponents to advance and eventually gain access to better cards, but the main purpose of these games was to implement online duels and multiplayer. What's interesting about these games though is that as of fall 2021, both of these games are still purchasable and have functioning online services despite them being 2 console generations behind now. Still though, most people don't use them anymore since many use either unofficial online simulators or games like Link Evolution, which I'll cover in a bit. In 2014, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal World Duel Carnival was released for the Nintendo 3DS. Although it had a physical release in some areas of the world, it was a digital eShop only title for North America. This one uses the Zexal cast and uses the September 2013 ban list because that's around the time this game was released in Japan. This game is noteworthy for having a lot more content in the Japanese version, such as a full detailed storyline for each individual character. There are much less playable characters and usable features outside of Japan, but overall the game has a story mode and free duel mode. Sadly, the combination of having a lot of features removed as well as many people not recognizing the cast at all because it's Zexal really made it suffer in sales and popularity. In the end, it's a pretty decent game and it does feature those new XC summoning mechanics, which wasn't present in any of the previously mentioned games because all those are 5Ds era and before. Still though, overall a nice fun game even if it did get severely hampered in content. There were 2 more games introduced in 2014. The first was Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Arena, a game released exclusively for PC and released exclusively in North America. To date, this is probably the biggest Yu-Gi-Oh! Failed video game ever, as it was only released for one platform, only released for one region, and was pretty much only for online dueling. It did have a limited single player mode where you simply duel opponents in order of increasing difficulty, but other than that, not really much else to it. Because of its very low player base and lack of popularity while costing Konami money and resources to maintain its servers, they made a decision to shut down the game in March of 2015. Considering it was released in May of 2014, it didn't even last a whole year before being shut down. The last game released in 2014 was Yu-Gi-Oh! Dual Generation. This one was released for mobile devices such as iOS and Android and was available as a free-to-play game with in-app purchases. This game was also discontinued, but it actually lasted about 6 years before its shutdown in September 2020. This game featured a tutorial mode, a campaign mode, weekly challenges, both offline mode and online mode, and over 7,000 cards available. Although it did shut down, considering it was released in 2014, many people speculate that it inspired an eventual more popular mobile game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Dueling, released in January 2017. To date, this is probably the most popular Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game of all time, as it was able to appeal to modern veteran players who appreciated a much slower format, but it was a very large contributing factor to the resurgence of older Yu-Gi-Oh! Players who had quit the game already for years. This is because it went back to the roots of Yu-Gi-Oh! But in a modified way. Basically, players only have a 20 card deck, 3 monster zones, 3 spell and trap zones, there's no main phase 2, and it also introduces players' skills, where a player can typically use these skills once or more in a duel that grants a nice boost in power to the user. The game also has single player and online mode, where it also has a unique format and ban list that's distinct from the real life card game. The ban list also works differently because cards on the limited list can only be used as one total card among all cards in that list, while cards on the limited 2 list, aka semi-limited, can only be used as 2 total copies among all cards in that list. The same rule applies for the limited 3 list. This format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Dueling was so popular that the game basically influenced speed duels in the real life card game, which is basically the same thing as Duel Links, except that it's the physical card game version. In 2015, YuGiOh Legacy of the Duelist was released for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, followed by a Steam release in 2016. This is a game where Konami had one primary goal in mind: to use it as the official auto simulator for Yu-Gi-Oh! It featured basically every card up until this point, and had a single player mode where you would relive the anime stories of Duel Monsters, GX, 5Ds, and Zexal, while also introducing a bit of pendulum summoning and Arc V in the game. For all duels, you can use either the pre-made story deck or your own custom deck, and for winning duels you get points which you can then spend in the card shop to upgrade your custom deck. The game also has reverse duels in which you take control of the other duelist instead. It was definitely a major hit, but in 2019, Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy of the Duelist Link Evolution was released for the Nintendo Switch. This was an updated and enhanced version of the original Legacy of the Duelist, and it would eventually get released for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Steam in 2020. Link Evolution added all the Arc V segments, which were previously only accessible as downloadable content for the original Legacy of the Duelist, but it also introduced V-Rains and Link summoning for this game. The game also basically has over 10,000 cards now, because it includes every card release up until this point. It also introduced summoning animations for various popular monsters, and overall the game was a major step forward in updating a game that desperately needed one. It does take a long time to collect every card in the game, though, as there are over 10,000 of them, but the many options available such as single player, reverse duels, duelist challenges, and sealed play offer many options to keep dueling and gaining more points. And now this brings us to the conclusion of the last 3 games yet to be released. The first is Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush Duel Saikyo Battle Royale, at least that's what it's called in Japan, and it's already been released there. It basically uses the new Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Rush Duel mechanics, and it brings back the whole free world exploration gameplay. It looks like it's a combination of going back to the roots of Yu-Gi-Oh! While also keeping the modern twist. Then there's Yu-Gi-Oh! Cross Duel, which is currently in closed beta at the time of this video's release and will be available for iOS and Android. It essentially uses 4-way dueling, kinda like the 4-way duel in the Battle City Finals in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. And the last is Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, a new official auto simulator that will have native 4K resolution on some platforms and will be available for Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series XS, Steam, iOS, and Android. Lots of platforms. Visually it looks beautiful, but many people, including many YuGiTubers, are suspicious of the game's monetization style, which may end up running many in-game purchases and will ultimately be a pay-to-win game. Who knows at this point, but I do know that many of us are super hopeful about it. Overall though, that's the entire history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games. As always, don't forget to leave that like, comment, subscribe, and turn on those notifications if you enjoyed the video. I will see you all next time. Bye bye everyone. Have a great day.